All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking what we call the engine of America. We're going to explore a visual timeline that highlights the absolute key turning points in American history. As we go through this, you'll see exactly how the map of the United States was relentlessly forged by this unstoppable cycle of massive territorial expansion and monumental conflict.
So how did a scattering of colonies transform into a 50-state global superpower? Well, the answer really lies in tracing a historical engine of growth that repeatedly, and sometimes violently, collided with massive internal and external forces. It's a fascinating story of action, reaction, and just constant forward momentum.
To put things into perspective, today the U.S. population sits at a staggering 340 million people. That makes it the third largest in the entire world. But to really understand how we got here, going from a vast indigenous continent to a handful of colonies, and finally to this massive modern populace, we literally have to start at the very beginning of the timeline.
Which brings us to Section 1, Colonization and Early Conflicts.
You know, the sheer scale of early history is just breathtaking. We accelerate from ancient Native American civilizations, like the incredible mound city of Cahokia that once actually rivaled London in size, directly into rapid European colonization following Columbus's landfall in 1492. From there, we hit the founding of Jamestown in 1607, and very quickly after, the fateful and tragic introduction of slavery in 1619. All of this incredibly rapid settlement pushes the population to over 1 million people in the 13 colonies by 1750.
But the continent wasn't just an English project. These early land grabs essentially set the stage for an inevitable clash. Think about it like a pressure cooker. You had the Spanish controlling Florida and the Southwest, the French claiming vast stretches of Canada in the Mississippi River Basin, and the English firmly established along the Atlantic coast. All these massive territorial claims began to press really tightly against one another, and eventually, something just had to give.
And that leads us right into Section 2, Revolution and Independence.
So there's a really clear cause and effect happening here. As the 13 colonies became more and more crowded, settlers naturally pushed west into the highly disputed Ohio River Valley. This action directly sparked the French and Indian War. And the reaction? Well, that war left Britain massively in debt. So, to pay it off, they slapped these deeply unpopular taxes on the colonies. That led straight to furious cries of no taxation without representation, and ultimately, full-blown armed revolution.
It's wild to see how quickly the colonies transitioned from a localized rebellion into a fully independent nation, from the very first shots at Lexington and Concord in 1775 to the Declaration of Independence just 1 year later, and the final British surrender at Yorktown. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, this brand new nation's borders stretched all the way from the Atlantic across to the Mississippi River.
Let's dive into Section 3, Manifest Destiny and Expansion.
It's important to recognize how tightly packed these historical turning points are. Almost every major land acquisition here is either immediately followed by or directly causes a devastating conflict or human tragedy. We go straight from buying Louisiana right into another war with Britain in 1812, and then the aggressive expansion into Texas, which leads directly to the Mexican-American War.
It's honestly mind-blowing how much territory was gained in just a few decades. Thomas Jefferson doubled the entire nation's size with the Louisiana Purchase from France. Then, the U.S. peacefully acquired the Oregon Territory from Britain, and through war, took over 500,000 square miles, including California, from Mexico. This effectively pushed the American frontier all the way to the Pacific Ocean in a remarkably short amount of time. However, we really have to zoom in here to acknowledge the brutal human cost of this growth. While the peaceful acquisition of the Louisiana Territory fueled a massive agricultural boom, the reaction, the drive to clear more land, was absolutely devastating. To make way for the booming, slave-fueled cotton economy in the Deep South, Native American tribes like the Cherokee and Creek were forcibly expelled from their ancestral homes under the 1830 Indian Removal Act. Thousands upon thousands died on the Trail of Tears. It's a stark, heartbreaking reminder of the human displacement occurring right behind the lines of that expanding map.
This brings us to Section 4, A Nation Divided by War.
All this expansion poses a critical, explosive question. What happens when new states are forced to choose between free and slave labor? Well, every single time the map grew, the nation fractured further over whether new territories would permit the brutal institution of slavery. This fundamental, irreconcilable divide was rapidly tearing the industrial North and the plantation South apart. It was a ticking time bomb.
600,000. That staggering number represents the American lives lost during the ensuing Civil War. This was a casualty rate of an almost unimaginable scale, primarily because you had newly industrialized forms of warfare colliding with old 18th century battlefield tactics. It remains a deeply defining structural tragedy of American history.
Moving through the 1860s, we trace the election of Abraham Lincoln straight into the outbreak of the Civil War. By 1865, Lee surrenders and the 13th Amendment legally abolishes slavery. And what's truly fascinating is what happens almost immediately after the nation stitches itself back together. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. This monumental engineering feat collapsed coast-to-coast travel times from grueling months down to just a few days, accelerating westward settlement at an absolutely unprecedented pace.
Okay, let's look at Section 5, Emerging as a Global Power.
These next acquisitions perfectly illustrate America's major leap onto the world stage. The continental frontier had essentially closed, so the engine of expansion shifted outward. We see the purchase of Alaska from Russia for a mere $7.2 million. Then in 1898, the annexation of Hawaii followed rapidly by gaining the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam after the Spanish-American War. The U.S. was swiftly transitioning from a purely continental project into a formidable imperial and industrial heavyweight.
But, of course, this newfound global presence came at a heavy cost. The first half of the 20th century violently dragged the expanding nation into major global conflicts. It bounced from entering World War I to the dizzying, fast-paced prosperity of the Roaring '20s, crashing hard into the Great Depression sparked by Black Tuesday, and finally being thrust into the defining fires of the Second World War after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. It all culminated in 1945 with the dropping of atomic bombs, permanently changing the nature of warfare forever.
116,000. These represent the American casualties in World War I alone. This number is absolutely vital to take away from this explainer because it marked the definitive end of America's early attempts at isolationism. It forced them to step up onto the global stage to provide much-needed manpower to beleaguered allies. After this, there was simply no going back.
Finally, Section 6, the modern superpower era. Coming out of World War II, the new global reality was defined by the tense Cold War divide. On one side, you had the democratic West, headed by the United States and backed by NATO. On the other, the communist East, headed by the USSR. What's absolutely crucial to understand here is that the struggle for global influence was no longer fought primarily with direct territorial expansion like we saw in the previous centuries. Instead, it was fought through global economics, through devastating proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam, and quite literally through the space race to put a man on the moon.
As we move through the late 20th century, we see massive internal milestones running parallel to these global events. The Civil Rights Movement violently and courageously dismantled Jim Crow laws, leading to the landmark Civil Rights Act in 1964. We see Apollo 11 actually landing on the moon. And then foreign policy drastically pivots again, from the triumphant fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union directly into a totally new kind of conflict, following the horrifying 9/11 attacks in 2001, which triggered the modern war on terror spanning 2 decades. That anyone from anywhere can arrive on its shores and claim for themselves life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as an American. As we step back and review thousands of years of prehistory, followed by over 250 years of it all really comes back to this core, foundational idea. Will this pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness continue to hold this 50-state superpower together into the future? That is the profound question this visual history leaves us with. Keep that in mind as you look at the world today. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.